The envelope was waiting on my doormat like it had been placed there with intent. White, stiff, official. My name typed correctly, not handwritten. A county seal in the corner. The kind of mail you don't toss on the kitchen counter and get to later. I stood in the hallway with my keys still in my hand and stared at it for a full 10 seconds before I picked it up. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't like surprises that came from institutions. Institutions don't send surprises, they send consequences. Inside my apartment, I set the envelope on the small table by the window, the one my late wife used to keep a vase on. I washed my hands first, habit from my old life. Then I opened it with the edge of a letter opener I've had for 20 years. The first line made my stomach go cold in a clean, quiet way. Notice of recording, deed transfer confirmation. I read it once, then again, slower. Then I sat down because my knees decided that was wiser than pride. According to the letter, a quitclaim deed had been recorded 3 days ago. It listed my address, my unit, my name as grantor, and the grantee wasn't my son. It wasn't my daughter. It was an LLC I'd never heard of, with a mailing address in a strip mall across town. A mistake, I told myself. A clerical error, a similar name, a wrong unit number. That's what reasonable people reach for first. But the parcel number was correct. My parcel number. I turned the page. There was a reference to the instrument number, the date of notarization, the notary's name, and the recording stamp, clean and final like a hammer strike. Notary. That word did something to me. It brought back old conference rooms, quiet signatures, the smell of toner, the careful way people lean in when they think they're getting away with something. I've spent most of my life around documents. I'm a retired probate attorney. For 35 years I watched families smile at hospital beds and then fight over houses before the sheets cooled. I drafted wills for people who thought love would protect them. I cleaned up estates where love had rotted into entitlement. I knew what this was before my mind finished saying it. This was theft, not the kind that involves a crowbar and a mask. The kind that wears a family name. My phone was on the table. I didn't pick it up right away. I walked to my desk instead and pulled out the folder where I keep my property papers, original deed, tax bills, insurance, the boring spine of a stable life. Everything was there, but the folder had been handled. The papers weren't in the order I kept them. A corner was bent where I don't bend corners. The thin plastic sleeve that holds my deed copy had a smudge, like someone's thumb had pressed too hard. Someone had been in my home. I checked the lock on my door. Still intact, no damage, which meant the person who entered had a key. I looked at the little hook by the kitchen where I keep my spare. The hook was empty. I stood there for a moment, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant elevator in the building. Ordinary sounds, my apartment pretending to be what it was yesterday. Then I called my son. He answered on the third ring with a voice that was too bright. Dad, hey, everything okay? I held the letter up even though he couldn't see it, like that would stop my hands from tightening. Did you take my spare key? I asked. A pause, just long enough. Laura borrowed it, he said. For emergencies, you know. Why? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I asked the question the way I used to ask clients when I already knew the answer and wanted to see if they'd lie to my face. Why does the county say I transferred my home to an LLC? Silence on the line. Not confusion. Not surprise. Silence. Then he exhaled, slow, like I was the burden here. Dad, he said, don't panic. It's just something we're setting up to simplify things. Simplify what? Taxes, probate, paperwork. You always said planning matters. I stared at the bent corner of my deed copy and felt something settle in my chest like a weight finding its place. I didn't sign anything, I said. Another pause. Then his tone shifted, softer, rehearsed. You've been forgetting things lately. There it was. Not concern. Not a question. A story. I heard a second voice in the background. Laura's, muffled but sharp. Tell him we did it for his own good. My son didn't deny it. He didn't defend me. He didn't even ask if the letter was real. He said, "Can we come by tonight? Let's talk like adults." I looked at the empty hook where my spare key had been. I pictured Laura in my apartment, touching my papers, taking photos, smiling while she did it. "Sure," I said calmly. "Come by." After I hung up, I didn't move for a full minute. Not because I was stunned. Because I was counting. 3 days since recording. A notary name. An instrument number. A missing spare key. A son already prepared to claim I was forgetful. This wasn't spontaneous. This was planned. And the worst part wasn't that they tried to take my home. It was that they tried to take my credibility first. I'm 72, and for most of my adult life I made my living by preventing families from hurting each other with paperwork. I was a probate attorney. Wills, trusts, estates, guardianships. The quiet legal machinery that starts turning the moment someone gets sick or dies. People think the courtroom is where families break. It usually happens at kitchen tables, with a pen passed around like it's harmless. I never enjoyed conflict, but I understood it. I learned early that the person who controls the documents controls the story. Signatures, dates, witnesses, notaries, a clean chain of custody. If you don't protect those things, someone else will use them against you and call it planning. I retired 5 years ago, after my wife, Marianne, died. She went quickly. An aneurysm, one ordinary Saturday morning and then nothing. After the funeral, my office felt pointless. I'd spent decades advising people to prepare for loss, and I still wasn't prepared for my own. I live in the same condo we bought 20 years ago. 3rd floor, brick building, quiet neighbors, a view of the parking lot that never pretends to be scenic. The place is paid off. That matters. It's not luxury, but it's stability, and stability is something I value more than most people understand. My days, before the county letter, were predictable in the best way. I wake up around 6, make coffee in a glass French press, and eat 2 pieces of toast while the radio talks about things I can't control. I read the news on a tablet, then I read it again slower because headlines are designed to make you react. I don't react on command. I keep my home orderly, not spotless. Keys on the hook by the door. Bills opened the day they arrive. Documents filed the same way every time. Marianne used to tease me about it. "You organize grief like it's a case file," she'd say. She wasn't wrong. Structure keeps the world from sliding. On Tuesdays I walk to the little market 3 blocks away. I buy apples, eggs, plain yogurt, and coffee beans from the bin that smells like chocolate. On Thursdays I water the plants Marianne insisted on keeping alive. Only 2 survived her, and I keep them alive out of stubborn respect. On Sundays I call my sister and let her talk about her grandchildren until my ear gets warm. My son, Eric, used to be part of that calm routine. He's 44 now, a project manager with a talent for sounding busy even when he isn't. After Marianne died, he called often, checking in, asking if I needed anything, offering to handle errands. I told him I was fine. I meant it. I wasn't alone. I was just quieter. Then he married Laura. She's the type who speaks in helpful phrases. Streamline, simplify, set you up. She always smiles first, like it's a requirement. In the beginning, I tried to like her. I really did. I invited them for dinner. I complimented her cooking even when it was dry. I listened when she talked about family legacy, as if she'd invented the concept. But even then, I noticed the way her eyes lingered on details that weren't hers. My framed certificate from the Bar Association. The folder cabinet in my study. The safe deposit key in the little dish by my desk. She'd ask questions that sounded casual. "Do you have everything organized? Is the condo in your name only? Have you updated your will recently?" I answered politely, the way you do when you don't want to turn family into a deposition. Before the letter arrived, I still believed my home was mine in the fullest sense. My door, my keys, my documents, my choices. I believed family might be annoying, might be pushy, but would stop short of fraud. That was before, and before ended the moment a government envelope told me my home no longer belonged to me. Eric didn't take my house by force. He didn't threaten me, and Laura never raised her voice. They entered my life the way people do when they intend to stay unnoticed, through convenience, familiarity, and the soft authority of family. It began after Marianne died. At first, Eric's involvement felt natural. He checked in more often. He offered to help with errands, asked if I wanted company on weekends, suggested I shouldn't be alone so much. Those are normal things for a son to say, and I accepted them as such. Grief lowers your guard. You mistake proximity for loyalty. Laura arrived wrapped in usefulness. She brought food I hadn't asked for, organized shelves I hadn't complained about, and offered to take some pressure off whenever paperwork appeared. She never demanded control. She volunteered assistance, which is much harder to refuse without looking ungrateful. The first real access point was the spare key. I had always kept one on a hook in the kitchen, mostly out of habit. Laura noticed it almost immediately. She commented casually, the way people do when they're testing a boundary. "It's good you have that," she said, "in case something happens." A week later, Eric asked if they could hold onto it. "Just for emergencies," he said. "Falls, locked doors, that sort of thing." I hesitated, but I said yes. It was my son. I told myself I wasn't surrendering anything, just preparing for unlikely events. One key, one small concession. After that, their presence expanded. Laura began stopping by when I wasn't home. At first she told me, "I dropped off groceries. I checked your mail." Then she stopped mentioning it unless I asked. She'd comment on things she couldn't have known otherwise. The temperature in my apartment, a flickering light, papers left on my desk. Eric started handling small matters, setting up online accounts I'd avoided, offering to scan documents so everything's backed up, resetting passwords when a site acted strange. Each task sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a map. Laura took particular interest in documents. She asked where I kept my property records, where my will was stored, whether my deed had ever been updated. She spoke as if she were thinking ahead for me, framing everything as efficiency. I answered carefully, but I answered. I didn't realize then that every answer narrowed my margin. The spare key stopped being for emergencies. It became permission. They let themselves in. They rearranged papers. They took photos. They learned my habits, my filing system, the cadence of my days. Eric knew when I went out. Laura knew what drawers I didn't lock. By the time I noticed how often decisions were being discussed without me, the access was already normalized. They spoke in plural terms. "We'll handle it. We talked about it. We decided," as if inclusion were automatic. I never signed anything. I never authorized transfers. I never gave consent. But I gave access. And access, once given, has a way of convincing people it was always theirs. The pressure didn't arrive as a demand. It arrived as improvement. Laura started fixing things that were not broken. My calendar changed without discussion. Appointments moved earlier so I wouldn't forget. A lunch I'd planned with a former colleague vanished from my schedule entirely. When I called him, confused, he apologized and said Laura had told him I wasn't feeling well and needed rest. She had sounded convincing. She always did. When I asked her about it, she smiled like I'd missed something obvious. "I thought Eric explained," she said. "You seemed overwhelmed lately." That word, lately, began appearing everywhere. It was soft, flexible, impossible to argue with. A timeline that only moved in one direction. Eric changed too. He started answering questions meant for me. At the bank, he explained my own accounts to the teller while I stood there. At the pharmacy, he confirmed prescriptions I'd already confirmed. When I corrected him, he laughed and said, "Dad's particular." People smiled. Authority evaporated quietly. My mail began arriving opened. Not all of it, only official letters, tax notices, insurance updates, anything that carried weight. Laura said she was helping me stay organized. She bought new folders and labeled them herself. My handwriting disappeared from my own records. She commented constantly on what I ate, on how late I stayed up, on how often I went out. Each comment carried the same implication. Observation granted permission. Isolation followed without announcement. Friends stopped calling as much. When I reached out, they said Laura had mentioned I needed space. That visits tired me, that I was slowing down. None of those words came from me, but they traveled well in other mouths. Conversations shifted. Laura spoke about me as if I weren't present. Eric discussed my future in the third person. Assisted living was introduced as a sensible option. Selling the condo described as inevitable. They used when, not if. I objected once. Calmly, Laura touched my arm and smiled. You don't need to get defensive, she said. That's not helping your case. She said case without realizing it. Decisions began happening without me. Eric reset passwords. For security. Laura contacted my insurance agent to confirm details. I was informed afterward, always reassured it was easier this way. I started locking my bedroom door at night. Laura noticed immediately. Are you afraid? She asked. No, I said. She didn't believe me. Belief wasn't required anymore. Humiliation came in small doses. Jokes about my memory. Stories about things I'd supposedly forgotten. Eric stayed silent. Silence did more damage than agreement ever could. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I adjusted. Slowly, deliberately, I felt myself being repositioned. From owner to obstacle, from authority to inconvenience. They behaved as if my autonomy were temporary, something to be managed until it expired. They called it care. What it really was erosion, patient, polite, and designed to leave me with nothing solid to stand on. And they believed I wouldn't notice until it was complete. I didn't confront them. That disappointed Laura. She expected resistance to grow louder as the pressure increased. Raised voices, accusations, emotional outbursts she could later point to and describe as instability. When none of that came, she adjusted her tactics and became bolder. Eric followed her lead. He always had. So I became quieter in a way that made them comfortable. I nodded more. I agreed without commitment. I said, that makes sense, and I'll think about it, and let those phrases hang without action. I allowed Laura to explain processes I had taught younger attorneys decades earlier. I let Eric help me log into accounts I'd managed my entire adult life. I watched carefully as he changed some passwords and pretended to change others. I noticed how Laura stood just behind him, memorizing keystrokes, watching reflections in the screen. I stopped correcting them in front of other people. When Laura told friends I was tired, I smiled faintly and said nothing. When Eric joked about me being old-fashioned or forgetful, I let the laughter run its course. Silence makes people careless. Objections make them cautious. At home, I observed patterns. Laura preferred weekday afternoons, when she assumed I was out walking or at the market. Eric came in the evenings, usually tired, less careful. Laura touched papers with bare hands and tried to put them back exactly as she found them. Eric didn't bother. He assumed familiarity excused disorder. I began leaving small markers. A receipt placed upside down. A folder aligned slightly crooked. A paperclip turned the wrong way. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would alarm anyone. When those details changed, I knew someone had been there. When they didn't, I knew they were adapting. They grew confident. Laura started tidying my study. Eric suggested shared cloud storage, so nothing gets lost. They spoke about my future as if it were already decided. Assisted living was mentioned casually, like a plan already approved. Selling the condo was described as practical, inevitable, necessary. I asked questions that sounded naive and listened closely to the answers. Laura talked too much when she felt superior. Eric lied when he felt cornered. I allowed both to happen. People reveal more when they believe you're no longer a threat. Inside, I wasn't afraid. Fear makes you rush. I wasn't angry either. Anger announces itself and invites countermeasures. What I felt was patience. For decades, I had watched cases unravel not because someone shouted, but because someone underestimated records, timelines, and quiet documentation. Systems fail slowly before they fail all at once. Laura believed control came from proximity. Eric believed it came from access. Neither understood leverage. They thought I was fading. What they were actually seeing was me stepping back far enough to understand the full shape of what they were doing, and how they planned to justify it when it was finished. Once I understood that, endurance stopped being passive. It became preparation. The moment didn't come with shouting or threats. It came with paperwork left where it didn't belong. I returned home earlier than usual one afternoon and knew immediately that someone had been inside. Not because anything was missing, but because everything looked arranged. My desk chair was pushed in. I never push it in. The lamp was angled away from the window. Someone had been reading there. On the center of my desk sat a single document, squared carefully to the edge, as if it were waiting for me. It was titled Affidavit of Incapacity. My name was typed at the top. My address. My date of birth. Below it, paragraphs describing progressive memory decline, difficulty managing financial affairs, and increased reliance on family members for decision-making. Language I'd written myself, years ago, for other families. Neutral words designed to do irreversible things. At the bottom was a notary block. Stamped. Signed. Laura's signature sat above it. There was a second signature line beneath hers. Blank, but dated. That date was today. I didn't feel anger. I felt confirmation. This wasn't preparation anymore. This was execution. Once that affidavit was filed, everything else would fall neatly into place. Guardianship, control of accounts, authority over my home, all wrapped in concern and sealed by process. I picked up the document and examined it closely. The notary stamp was legitimate. The formatting was correct. Whoever prepared it knew exactly what they were doing. I folded it carefully, returned it to the desk exactly as I'd found it, and restored the room to its previous state. Chair angled, lamp repositioned. No sign I'd been there. That evening, Eric arrived with Laura. They brought dinner. They talked too much. Laura kept glancing toward my study, waiting. I asked Eric about work. He answered without looking at me. Laura spoke about long days and how much responsibility she'd taken on. She wanted me to confront her, to react, to validate the story she was already writing. I didn't. Later, alone in my bedroom, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the decision settle completely. There is a line between tolerance and permission. That affidavit crossed it. From that moment on, I stopped enduring. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I didn't warn them. I didn't confront them. I simply stopped absorbing what they were doing and began preparing to end it. I opened my notebook, wrote the date, and added one sentence. They have moved from influence to removal. That was enough. The rest would be procedural. I didn't move fast. I moved clean. The first thing I did was stop treating this like a family problem. Family problems invite meetings and guilt. This was a document problem, and document problems require separation, records, and third parties who don't care who you share holidays with. I started with my own files. That night, after Eric and Laura left, I pulled every original I had: deed, title insurance, tax bills, WA documents, mortgage payoff letter, my will, my medical directive, the power of attorney forms I'd drafted years ago and never executed. I photographed each page under a desk lamp, then scanned them to an encrypted drive I kept from my law days. I created 2 copies and stored them in 2 different places. A single set of documents is a single point of failure. Next, I locked down identity. I placed a credit freeze with all 3 bureaus and requested a consumer disclosure report. I also set up fraud alerts and changed the email tied to my banking and county portal accounts. If Laura had been taking pictures of my mail, I assumed she had everything she needed to impersonate me. I removed that advantage. Then I dealt with access. I called a locksmith I'd used for a client years ago, an older man who asked few questions and did precise work. I told him I'd lost control of a spare key. He came the next morning, rekeyed the locks, and provided documentation of the change. I asked him to note the time and the reason on his invoice. It wasn't paranoia, it was chain of custody. After that, I pulled the county records myself. Not through a phone call, not through a clerk who might feel sympathetic, but through the recorder's office. I requested certified copies of the recorded quitclaim deed, the notary acknowledgement, and any supporting instrument linked to the filing. I wanted the exact language, the exact signatures, and the exact stamp impressions. I also requested the recording history, who submitted it, whether it was mailed or hand-delivered, and any payment method on file. Small details often identify the hand that moved the pen. I recognized the notary name immediately. Not personally, but professionally. A traveling notary service that had been involved in a messy guardianship case years ago. That didn't mean guilt. It meant I needed their log. I didn't contact them directly. I had my attorney do it. I called a colleague I trusted. A woman still practicing, sharp, unromantic, and immune to family theater. I told her only the facts. Deed transfer, unknown LLC, forged signature, spare key missing, and the first attempt to label me forgetful. I did not mention feelings. I didn't have to. She understood the shape immediately. Within 24 hours, she sent preservation letters to the notary service, the recorder's office, and the assisted living contact Laura had been sniffing around. Preserve logs. Preserve communications. Preserve metadata. Destroy nothing. When people realize you know how to force records into daylight, they start making mistakes. I also took care of witnesses without making a production. I spoke to my building manager and asked for hallway camera retention. Calmly, professionally. He wasn't thrilled, but he agreed once he heard the words, potential title fraud. I asked him to confirm, in writing, who had requested spare keys in the past and whether anyone had been let into my unit. He promised he'd check. Then I prepared my own credibility. I scheduled a cognitive evaluation and a general physical with a physician who had never met Laura. I paid out of pocket and requested full notes. I knew exactly what Laura was building. A story where any resistance could be framed as confusion. I removed that weapon before she could swing it. Finally, I set the trap I was most comfortable with. I stopped confronting. I stopped asking questions. I became agreeable again. I let Eric believe we'd talk it out. I let Laura believe I was rattled and unsure. Because if they thought I was scared, they would hurry. And hurried people sign their own names to things they shouldn't. Once Laura believed the paperwork was nearly finished, her discipline slipped. Control makes people careless. Urgency makes them loud. The first mistake came by text. She sent it mid-morning, cheerful and familiar. The way people write when they believe the ground is already theirs. Don't worry about the condo stuff, she wrote. Eric and I handled the last details with the county. You don't need the stress. She didn't ask, she informed. That message mattered. It placed intent, timing, and awareness in writing. It acknowledged action taken without consent. It framed my exclusion as a benefit. I saved it and did not respond. The second mistake followed an hour later. My attorney received a call from the notary service. Laura had contacted them directly, impatient, asking whether the backup affidavit had been logged yet. She gave my name, my address, and referred to me as declining. She assumed the file was internal and cooperative. The notary logged the call. People forget that professionals document uncomfortable conversations, especially when someone sounds rushed and entitled. The third mistake came from Eric. He stopped by that evening without warning, alone, and stayed standing near the door like a man testing a room for exits. He talked too much. About taxes, about responsibility, about how hard Laura had been working to protect everyone. He kept using plural language. We decided, we agreed, we thought, as if repetition could manufacture legitimacy. Then he said the wrong thing. You signed so many documents over the years, Dad. You can't honestly expect to remember every one. He said it casually, as if memory were negotiable. I didn't argue. I asked a single neutral question. Which document are you referring to? He hesitated. Too long. That's what I thought, I said quietly. His face tightened. Not anger, fear. He realized then that he was speaking without a script, and that silence might expose more than denial ever could. The fourth mistake came from Laura's confidence. She sent an email to the LLC's registered agent, copied to Eric, discussing next steps once possession issues are resolved. She used my address as if it were already theirs to manage. She referred to me as the occupant. Occupant. That word stripped away any remaining pretense. It wasn't about planning. It was about replacement. The fifth mistake came from impatience again. Laura contacted my building manager directly, asking about parking assignments after the transfer. She assumed cooperation. She didn't expect him to forward the message to me with a note that read, "This seemed odd." Each mistake stacked cleanly on the last. Texts, emails, logged calls, written assumptions, a paper trail built not by me, but by their belief that they were already beyond challenge. They thought speed would protect them. Instead, it documented intent. By the time Laura realized something was wrong, by the time her calls stopped being returned and her emails received formal replies, it was already too late to fix what she'd put in writing. They hadn't been caught. They had revealed themselves. And once people do that, the outcome stops being emotional. It becomes mechanical. I didn't confront them. I escalated past them. On Monday morning, I went to the county recorder's office in person. Not to ask questions, but to create a record. I requested certified copies of every instrument associated with my parcel number for the last 12 months. The clerk printed them without comment. Clerks don't speculate. They stamp. The quitclaim deed was exactly what I expected. Clean formatting, correct parcel, my name typed accurately. The forgery was competent enough to pass a casual glance. It would not survive scrutiny. The notary acknowledgement was the weak point. It always is. I filed an affidavit of forgery that same morning. Not emotional, not accusatory, factual. I stated, under penalty of perjury, that I had not signed the deed, had not appeared before the notary, and had not authorized any transfer. I attached my specimen signatures from decades of bar filings and a copy of my current identification. The clerk recorded it immediately. That single document froze everything. Once a forgery affidavit is recorded, title companies stop pretending ambiguity exists. The LLC's supposed ownership became radioactive. No sale, no refinance, no leverage, just a problem that needed explaining. My attorney moved next. She filed a civil action for quiet title and fraud, naming the LLC, Eric, and Laura individually. She also filed an emergency motion for injunctive relief to bar any further transfers, encumbrances, or occupancy changes. The judge granted it the same day. Judges don't like forged deeds. They don't like family explanations even less. Then came the notary. Under subpoena, the traveling notary service produced its log. The entry for my supposed signing showed a problem immediately. The location listed was my condo. The time was 2:15 p.m. on a Thursday. I had been in court that afternoon. On the record, in another county, a transcript doesn't forget. The notary hadn't met me. Laura had produced a copy of my ID and claimed I was not feeling well and didn't want to talk. The notary accepted the explanation, notarized the signature without direct acknowledgement, and logged it. That single decision moved the matter from civil into regulatory territory. The Secretary of State's office was notified. So was the notary's bonding company. By Wednesday, the LLC's registered agent had resigned. By Friday, the LLC's bank account was frozen pending investigation. Eric's credit union flagged unusual activity. Laura's employer received a subpoena for communications conducted during work hours. Consequences spread outward the way they always do when documentation is clean. Eric tried to call. I didn't answer. Laura sent a message accusing me of betrayal. I saved it. The court hearing took place 2 weeks later. Laura sat rigid, jaw tight, still convinced this was a misunderstanding that could be reframed. Eric looked smaller than I remembered, eyes darting, hands folded like he was waiting to be told what to do. The judge didn't ask about intentions. He asked about signatures, logs, and timelines. My attorney spoke for 12 minutes. Laura's attorney spoke for 45 and said very little. The ruling was precise. The deed was voided. Title was restored in full. The injunction became permanent. The court referred the notary matter for disciplinary action and allowed the fraud claim to proceed. Eric and Laura were ordered to have no contact with my property or financial affairs. No speeches, no scolding, just correction. When it was over, I walked out of the courthouse alone and sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I didn't feel victorious. I felt restored. By the time I drove home, my phone was silent. My door opened the way it always had. And this time, it closed behind me without question. They didn't try to undo it right away. That would have looked desperate, and Laura never liked to look desperate. The first contact came 5 days after the injunction became permanent. Eric sent an email, not a call. He always preferred distance when he wasn't sure where he stood. The subject line read, "Can we talk?" The message itself was long and careful. He wrote about stress, about misunderstandings, about how fast things had gotten out of hand. He said Laura had only been trying to help. He said neither of them had expected things to go this far. He used the word family 3 times and the word lawyer not at all. He did not deny the deed. He did not mention the notary. He did not say he was sorry. He asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. Coffee, lunch, just the two of us. I didn't respond. 2 days later, Laura tried a different approach. She left a voicemail. Her voice softer than I'd ever heard it, trembling just enough to sound sincere without sounding weak. She talked about how hurt she was, how betrayed she felt, how shocked she'd been by my reaction. She said she never imagined I would involve the courts against my own family. That sentence mattered. Not she never imagined she'd crossed a line. Not she never imagined forging a deed would have consequences. She never imagined I would respond. After that came the pressure through others. My sister called, confused, asking why Eric said I was cutting him out. A cousin emailed to say families make mistakes and forgiveness matters. An old colleague suggested I was being too rigid and that life is short. None of them mentioned the deed. None of them mentioned the forgery. They talked about harmony, healing, moving forward, all the words people use when they want outcomes without accountability. Laura sent one final email a week later. Shorter this time, sharper. She accused me of humiliating her, of damaging Eric's career, of destroying trust. She said everything they'd done was for my benefit and that I was being vindictive by refusing to let it go. She ended with, "You owe us a conversation." That was when I finally replied. Not to her, not to Eric. I forwarded the message to my attorney. My attorney responded with one sentence, copied to both of them. All communication must comply with the court's order. Any further attempts at contact outside those terms will be documented. After that, the messages stopped. Not because they understood, because they recognized the limits were real. They hadn't wanted reconciliation. They'd wanted leverage, a chance to reframe, renegotiate, or guilt me into softening the consequences. Once it was clear that nothing would be softened, nothing more was said. Silence, in this case, was not remorse. It was retreat. The house did not feel different afterward. That was the first thing I noticed. No sudden peace, no dramatic relief, just the same quiet rooms, the same light falling across the floor at the same angles it always had. That mattered to me. It meant the damage had been external, not structural. The place hadn't been violated beyond repair. It had simply been tested. The legal work finished itself the way it always does, slowly, methodically, without ceremony. The fraudulent deed was expunged from the record. Title insurance reaffirmed ownership. The injunction stood. The LLC dissolved quietly, its usefulness gone. The notary lost their commission. Eric and Laura's names became associated with something no professional file likes to carry. I did not follow the details closely. Once the system had enough information, it didn't need supervision. I changed the locks again, even though the first change was still recent. Not out of fear, but out of finality. I removed the hook where the spare key had hung and patched the screw holes. I replaced the deadbolt with one that turns with a solid, deliberate resistance. Mechanisms should feel certain. I reorganized my study over the course of a week, not in a rush, one drawer at a time. I removed the folders Laura had labeled and replaced them with my own, handwritten, familiar. I kept the forged copies, the emails, the texts, and the court orders in a separate box, sealed and dated. Not to dwell on them, but because records don't exist for memory. They exist for proof. My routines returned, adjusted but intact. Morning coffee, toast, the radio murmuring about things far away. Market walks twice a week. The same apples, the same vendor. He nodded when he saw me, the way people do when they notice consistency. On Sundays, I still called my sister. She stopped trying to mediate once she understood there would be nothing to negotiate. I did not speak to Eric again. That wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary. Relationships depend on shared reality, and ours no longer had one. I don't hate him. Hate is loud and wasteful. I simply recognized that he chose convenience over integrity and expected me to supply the cost. Laura disappeared entirely from my life, which is exactly where she belongs. I don't wonder what she tells people. Stories require an audience, and I'm no longer available. I added one new habit. Once a month, I review my records as if I were a stranger. Deed, accounts, authorizations, access points, not because I expect another attempt, but because vigilance is cheaper than recovery. Control is not paranoia, it's maintenance. I live alone, but I am not isolated. Friends come by when invited. Neighbors wave. The building manager treats me like a resident again, not a problem to monitor. When I lock my door at night, it is an act of routine, not defense. The quiet now feels earned. People think justice is loud. It isn't. Justice is when the system restores the correct shape of things and then steps back. What remains is responsibility. Knowing who is allowed close, who is not, and why. My life is smaller than it once was, but it is clean. No shared access, no borrowed authority, no assumptions disguised as care. I wake up in a home that is legally, practically, and morally mine. That is the new order. Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout, it keeps records.